Hi, this is Adam Feinberg, and I am recording for Harlem Stories. Unfortunately, my co-host Mark Becker is not available with us today, but we're gonna still give you some great material. I'll miss his banter, but at the same time, I think we can have some really interesting conversation here. Morningside Heights, is our topic today. We're going to talk about, how the neighborhood is so rich in higher education. And it's, even though it's best known for Columbia University, it's merely one of just many schools in the neighborhood. By the way, we are now going on episodes that are bi-weekly, rather than the weekly schedule, because to try and give you great quality material, it does take a tremendous amount of time to come up with the topics and and the raw material. So I really want to deliver some great material for everyone to listen to, and as a result, that takes a little longer. So we're going with a bi-weekly schedule going forward. So back to our topic of Morningside Heights, and we've had multiple episodes and some of the history of it, and some various different intertwining effects. We're past the now release of the movie Oppenheimer, and we talked about how the Manhattan Project and the nuclear. Some of the nuclear, research, had taken place in Columbia and Morningside Heights as a result. And there was a forgotten nuclear lab that has not been active in that nuclear testing lab that has not been active in that capacity for quite some time. But ultimately, the neighborhood is actually quite rich, and in academia, there's parks to the east, there's parks to the west. There's also, Sakura Park, just a bit north of the main campus, south of the new campus. And just going back a little bit, technically, Morningside Heights is part of West Harlem. West Harlem, which is made up of the three neighborhoods of Morningside Heights, Manhattanville, and Hamilton Heights, all part of Community District 9. Many people tend to characterize the neighborhood as part of the Upper West Side. If you're going back in time, it was until the late 1800s when Morningside Park was finally completed. Morningside is now considered part of the Bloomingdale neighborhood, and which is run from 96th to 110th Street and west of Broadway. Which that neighborhood really does feel like an extension of the Upper West Side. And then we can obviously tie back, some of the neighborhood connections, in history going further back. We had an episode where we discussed the Battle of Harlem Heights versus the British. It was George Washington's army, and that was in September of 1776. While America declared its independence from Britain on July 4th, 1776, the war actually didn't end until later on. And the most intense fighting occurred in a sloping wheat field, now part of Barnard College, with George Washington leading the Continental Army. And you can find a plaque commemorating this at the gate of 117th and Broadway, so that still remains, on site. If you're going back to Morningside Heights and that early history over there, back to the early 1800s, early to mid 1800s, I'd say, the neighborhood was largely undeveloped except for Bloomingdale Insane Asylum and the Leek and Watts Orphan Asylum. And actually, I know when it might be good for us to bring in on a later date. One of our Elgrin agents actually has a family member tied into that original orphan asylum. So, maybe we can get him in and discuss that in an additional episode. Um, in 1842, the Croton Aqueduct was opened and was above ground in the neighborhood. A gatehouse for that aqueduct still exists at 113th in Amsterdam. And I know that we'll talk about the remnants of the Croton Aqueduct in an additional episode at a later point as well. The landscape designer Frederick Law Olmsted, who most people, if they are familiar with his name, are familiar with, creating Riverside Park and Central Park. He was hired in 1873 to 1880 to, as I said, design Riverside Drive as well as Riverside Park. And along with Calvert Vaux, he also designed Morningside Park, completed in 1895. This team of Olmsted and Vaux, the two of them designed so many parks and public spaces throughout New York City. Their influence is still felt today, and many of the spaces they designed, back then are only slightly changed, if much at all, over the years. But what's interesting in that era of that early to mid 1800s, if you looked at around 110th Street near Broadway, before Bloomingdale Road, which is now known as Broadway, it was widened and straightened, and at that point in time, it was known as Dixonville, since it was the Dixon family that put up the wood frame houses. And it was specifically meant to house at that time German and Irish immigrants. And, as a result of, these being, immigrant areas and, there was need for entertainment, saloons and dance halls started popping up and, was a popular destination for younger crowds looking for a beer and a show. And of course, during that period, attracting some vaudeville performances. It was compared to Coney Island, and some even began calling the area Little Coney Island. I didn't even know that actually until I actually started, looking at, the material and started going through that. So that would kind of surprise me a little bit. And if you look at the late 1800s to early 1900s, you started having new construction apartment buildings or apartment homes in Morningside Heights. And most of it was actually just designed by just a few of the pre-war architects of their era, and it was just a few firms: the Paterno brothers, George Pelham, Neville Baggy, and the firm of Schwartz and Gross. So those few architectural firms, they were just they were the superstars, and they actually did so many of the buildings. Well, if you go to the, start going to the mid 1900s, beyond time period, the city saw decay in the late 1950s, and the revival kind of started in the 1980s to a degree, but it was really the 1990s that really experienced huge improvements. Now, I went to NYU, in the mid 90s. Back then, I was warned that if you go to visit friends up at Columbia, that it could be a little rough. But it was at that time that the neighborhoods were changing so dramatically. And and it's interesting because you talk to old time New Yorkers, a lot of times they're like, yeah, you don't go above 110th Street, and so much has changed over the decades. I get people that hadn't visited in like 10 or 15 years, and they're surprised just how much it's changed even since then. So from that period, we onward, we've started actually seeing quite a bit of improvements in terms of academics, and I think that's really at this point what Morningside is best known for. There's actually, and I knew this previously, but until I started really just putting a pen to paper and really started working on this episode, it really didn't occur to me that there's actually 7 major schools, for higher education. And keep in mind that Morningside is pretty short neighborhood as a result. It's not that many blocks. It goes from roughly about 110th to 125th. That's only about 15 blocks long, and it's only a few avenues wide. So the concentration of all these higher educational programs, is pretty intense, and you're talking about 7 major schools. Now, the most prominent of these schools is obviously Columbia University. It was originally known as King's College back when the British ruled America, and it was renamed after our independence. So obviously, King's College and Columbia, have a history, in New York that go way, way back. Then there's Barnard. It's actually only 4 acres in total, and it was created because women weren't permitted to take classes at Columbia. They'd be given a syllabus and an exam. If the woman had passed the exam, she could get a degree. So, now Barnard today is obviously, a women's, learning education institution. And as a result, it's separate and distinct from Columbia, but at the same time, when you get your degree from Barnard, it does have Columbia University, referenced on that degree. There's also Teachers College, and an interesting fact of Teachers College, it's got the oldest pool still in use in New York City, and one of the oldest pool, and it's one of the oldest in the nation. It was built as part of the largest gymnasium for women in the country too. But Teachers College is well known for their, some of the highest standards that you can find for the, for people that are pursuing the, education as a career. Manhattan School of Music is located there. Again, one of the most prestigious schools in the nation for music. You've got Bank Street, College of Education, also, top educational tier. You've got Union Theological Seminary, and I guess at this point, going back to our my career in real estate is Union Theological Seminary, and we'll talk about Jewish Theological Seminary also in right around the corner. But Union Theological Seminary, the buildings needed quite a bit of investment. And one way of doing that is, the building is, now doing hard hat tours, and, first closings are going to be coming up soon. Maybe by the time that this episode drops to the public, it'll actually be live. But Union Theological Seminary, what they did is, in order to raise money to maintain their buildings, they've agreed to allow a developer to build condos above one of the university buildings. So the lower, I believe, the building name is called Claremont Hall at 100 Claremont Avenue. And I believe the building actually starts, there's a lobby level, but then it goes, above that, floors 2 through 9 are part of Union Theological Seminary, and floors 10 on up are for the condominium. So it is a luxury building, absolutely beautiful. But it's just important to know that that's the current connection with real estate. Jewish Theological Seminary America is literally around the corner from Union Theological, and they went and took a slightly different approach to the same issue. As the buildings needed modernization and updating and maintenance, and they sold a parcel to a developer, and that property is now Vanderwater. And between Vanderwater and Claremont Hall, they're both excellent luxury buildings. Something that was kind of I actually believe was needed, because most of the neighborhood, especially with shortage of housing with Columbia and all these educational institutions, people coming from all around the world. There was always a shortage of housing in that area. People wanted to be close by. So, this adds quite a number of housing units to the neighborhood, and it was an interesting and unique way to do it. Other notable institutions, that I think are worth mentioning in this episode is the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. It's actually the world's 6th largest church by area. It's considered unfinished, with only about 2/3 of the original plan completed. Yet at the same time, it's the 6th largest church in the world. So even as it's still remains incomplete, it's still massive. Work began on the cathedral in construction on it in 1893, and builders unexpectedly hit deep soft shell pockets instead of the expected bedrock. So they kept drilling deep shafts until they hit bedrock and then filled it with concrete. The 600-foot long cathedral opened in 1941. Obviously, there's a big difference from 1893 to 1941, so it took them a long time before they could actually open it, because the soft ground. But when it did open in 1941, it was the 2nd largest in the world, behind St. Peter's Basilica. And then work stopped after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and didn't begin again until 1978 on the 2 western towers, which extended their heights by 150 feet. And, yet again, it kind of helps explain, why it's unfinished. Work stopped again in 1992 due to lack of funds. And in 2001, a fire pushed back any plans for finishing the remaining 1/3 of the plan. Well, that's quite a bit. I mean, as it's the 6th largest, and it was only 2/3 built. Crazy. So, another interesting point about it is that Keith Haring, the artist, his last work before his death was The Life of Christ. There are 9 versions of this triptych cast in bronze, covered in white gold, one of which is located in St. John's the Divine's, the National AIDS Memorial. And occasionally on special events or such as like Open House New York, occasionally the cathedral will allow visitors access to its roofs, allowing for not only unique vista of the city, but also for close-ups with some of its beautiful stained glass windows, some of which hold world records. So this is a pretty cool place, and this is coming from a guy that is not Christian. So occasionally, the campus of the cathedral allows visitors to stroll through a biblical garden where the different plants of all species that are mentioned in the Bible. I don't think the peacocks are there anymore, but I know that there were peacocks on site. There's 15,000 honeybees, and there was also the Peace Fountain designed in 1985 by Greg Wyatt. The fountain was created to mark the 200th anniversary of the Diocese of New York. It depicts the Archangel Michael embracing one of 9 giraffes after his defeat of Satan. There's also a lion lying down on a label, and the fountain's spiraling base represents a double helix of DNA. So this is, where, I guess science and faith, intersect, and, I think that's pretty cool. another notable institution worth mentioning in Morningside, Riverside Church. And if you go to the upper floors of Claremont Hall, you'll actually get a up close version of it. It's the tallest church in the U.S. and the 24th tallest in the world at 392 feet tall. It's got the 14th largest organ in the world, and numerous statues of scientists. So again, the intersection of science and faith. And believe it or not, the Riverside Church used to also have a bowling alley in its basement. I don't know what's since become of the bowling alley, but that's certainly unusual and unexpected to find in a church. One of the other awesome sites I mentioned, Grant's Tomb, and we're actually going to have a whole discussion on Grant's tomb in a future episode, but it is the tomb of Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia. So when you get the trivia question, who's buried in Grant's tomb? Grant and his wife Julia. So that always tends to come up. Absolutely beautiful monument. The Parks Department, has a place where you can, get information on the site. You can take self-guided tours. It is absolutely spectacular site. And I think before we wrap up this episode, I got to get into pop culture a little bit, and we'll talk about more about this in a future episode as well. Tom's Diner. So I normally, in most of my episodes, I'm trying to make things kind of timeless, so that if you listen to the episode a few years ago, a few years from now, then you'll be able to hear, some of the same, things and visit the same places that are mentioned in the episodes. So, I'm less keen on mentioning restaurants that might kind of change hands or names or go out of business or whatnot. But here's one that's really worth mentioning because it comes up in pop culture quite a bit. Monk's Diner in Seinfeld is actually based on Tom's Diner in Morningside Heights at Broadway and 112th. And it was also famous for the Suzanne Vega song, Tom's Diner. So, of course, that is, the reason why I'm mentioning it. There's more to discuss on the building associated with Tom's Diner and connection to NASA, which we'll discuss in a future episode. But for now, I think this kind of gives you a sense and a good rundown of just, some interesting sites in Morningside Heights, along with it's not just known for Columbia, but, it's many, higher educational facilities that are based in the neighborhood. And considering it's a pretty small neighborhood, that's pretty impressive. Well, thank you so much for listening to us again. This is another episode of Harlem Stories. We hope to always bring you great content and interesting things. We're not historians, but we like to talk about history. So hopefully we brought some interesting points, food for thought for you. And, when you go to visit these neighborhoods or, maybe you live near them or in them, and, maybe we brought you something of interest to listen to. So thank you so much for listening, and we will speak to you soon.